Welcome. Let us begin our journey, traveling back more than a millennium, to a world where the echoes of empire still whispered through forests, rivers, and ruined cities. The Western Roman Empire had fallen less than a century ago, and Europe, once tightly bound by roads, law, and administration, had splintered into a patchwork of kingdoms. It is the 5th century, a time when the shadow of Rome still lingers, yet new powers are rising, and the first sparks of what we now call the medieval world begin to take shape. In the north, the Franks established themselves in Gaul. They were a people of both cunning and ferocity, skilled in warfare and diplomacy. Their king, Clovis I, would become legendary, not only for his victories but for the careful blending of military skill, strategy, and political foresight. Across the Pyrenees, the Visigoths controlled much of Iberia, a kingdom carrying the remnants of Roman administration and culture, yet defined by the will of its warrior elites. Italy saw the Lombards moving in, establishing duchies and challenging the remaining influence of the Eastern Roman Empire. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Anglo-Saxons were consolidating their hold over England, building kingdoms from the scattered remnants of Roman settlements. Early medieval warfare was both brutal and intimate. Armies were smaller than those of later centuries, rarely exceeding a few thousand men. Soldiers relied on mail armor, round shields, swords, axes, and spears. Cavalry was emerging as a decisive force, but infantry remained essential. Formations were simple yet effective. Lines of men shoulder to shoulder, shields interlocked, ready to hold or advance as one. Victory was measured not merely by the dead left on the field, but by the capture of territory, the subjugation of people, and the solidification of political power. One of the earliest recorded battles of this period was the Battle of Vouillers in 507. Clovis III, king of the Salian Franks, faced Alaric II of the Visigoths. In southern Gaul, the Visigoths arrayed themselves with disciplined infantry and mobile cavalry. Clovis, understanding the advantage of terrain, positioned his men along the riverbanks of the Claine, restricting cavalry movements and preparing for a confrontation that would test the discipline and courage of both sides. The battle itself was likely chaotic, yet strategically significant. Shield walls met with a crashing sound, swords clanged, and the cries of men filled the misty air. Clovis' use of the terrain allowed his forces to resist cavalry charges and eventually pressed the Visigoths into retreat. Alaric II fell during the engagement, and the Frankish kingdom expanded, laying a foundation for what would later become a dominant European power. It was a victory measured not only by the battlefield outcome, but by the broader political and cultural consequences, a theme that would recur across the centuries. As we move into the 7th and 8th centuries, the British Isles offer a vivid picture of constant territorial struggle. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia were frequently at war with one another. Their armies relied heavily on infantry formations, known as shield walls, dense lines of warriors, holding their shields side by side to resist both cavalry and infantry attacks. Leaders, including kings and earls, often fought alongside their men, exposing themselves to the same dangers as their soldiers. Among the most famous engagements of this period was the Battle of Edington in 878. King Alfred of Wessex confronted the invading forces of Guthrum, a Danish Viking leader. The Vikings, swift and formidable, had conquered large swathes of England, leaving Wessex as the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon independence. Alfred, understanding that open-field confrontation would likely be disastrous, fortified a narrow valley along a river. There, the West Saxons awaited the Viking advance, using the natural bottleneck to neutralize their mobility When the battle began, it was a clash of disciplined defense and aggressive assault. By the end of the day, Alfred's forces had prevailed, and Guthrum was captured and later baptized, a symbolic and strategic end to the Viking campaign in Wessex. Meanwhile, on the continent, the rise of the Carolingian dynasty brought new dynamics to warfare. Charles Martel, a masterful strategist, confronted the Umayyad forces, advancing from Iberia in the Battle of Tours in 732. The battlefield was a rolling plain in southern Gaul, quiet with the mist of morning dew, yet pregnant with tension. Martel's army, primarily infantry with supporting cavalry, formed a dense line, prepared to withstand the superior numbers of the Umayyad forces. When combat began, cavalry charges clashed against the steadfast infantry. Arrows filled the air, clanging swords met shields, and commanders moved along the lines, urging their men to hold firm. The day ended with a decisive Frankish victory, preserving the Christian kingdoms of northern Europe and earning Martel the title the Hammer. To the north, the Viking Age brought sudden, often terrifying, conflict to northern Europe. Seafaring Norse warriors, navigating rivers and oceans in longships, struck with speed and unpredictability. Battles were chaotic, often appearing suddenly in villages or on the open field. One notable example occurred at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. Slightly later, but illustrative of Viking tactics, King Harold of England faced the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada. Despite the Vikings' reputation for aggressive mobility and fearsome combat skills, the English shield walls held firm. By the battle's end, Harold's forces had achieved victory, though at significant cost, weakening them for the later confrontation at Hastings. The Norman Conquest of England later, that same year, exemplifies the evolving tactics of the medieval battlefield. At Hastings, Duke William of Normandy employed a combination of archers, infantry, and cavalry. Norman strategy included feigned retreats to lure English soldiers from their defensive lines. Arrows rained down upon disordered formations, while cavalry charges exploited weaknesses, ultimately securing William's victory and transforming the English landscape of power, language, and law. Further south, Norman campaigns in southern Italy and Sicily illustrate the fusion of military traditions. The Normans incorporated Byzantine, Arab, and Lombard techniques, combining heavy cavalry with archers and engineers. The siege of Palermo in 1072 demonstrated patience, ingenuity, and strategic calculation. Attackers constructed towers, dug tunnels, and methodically reduced defenses, reflecting an evolving understanding of siege warfare that would influence European armies for centuries. By the 12th century, the Crusades would bring European armies into contact with the Middle East, combining combat, religion, and logistics in unprecedented ways. The First Crusade, including battles such as Dorylaeum in 1097, saw knights and infantry face the Seljuk Turks. Heavy cavalry charged to break enemy lines, while infantry protected flanks and fortified positions. Armies moved across vast distances, relying on supply lines, local intelligence, and careful coordination. Siegecraft became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating mangonels, trebuchets, and defensive countermeasures such as boiling oil and countermines. Through these centuries, warfare was not only about conflict, but about the culture and values of the time. The rise of chivalry emphasized honor, loyalty, and training among knights. Castles became not only defensive structures, but also centers of power and symbols of authority. Armies were communities, bound by shared endurance, fear, and hope. Leaders were remembered not only for victories, but for justice, piety, and care for their people. By the end of the 12th century, medieval warfare had grown in scale and complexity. Armies were larger, formations more disciplined, and strategy increasingly sophisticated. cavalry and infantry operated together, sieges became more elaborate, and commanders balanced courage with calculated risk. Yet the human element remained constant. Fear, endurance, camaraderie, and determination shaped every battle, siege, and campaign. Picture a battlefield at dawn. Mist rises from rivers and valleys. Banners flutter softly, and soldiers prepare quietly. The clinking of armor, the soft calls of commanders, and the slow rhythm of marching men create a sense of calm before action. This is the early medieval world, a world of courage, strategy, and resilience, stretching across the decades as kingdoms rose and fell, warriors fought, and history unfolded. As we continue our journey through the early medieval world, we move into the 7th and 8th centuries, a period of profound change and consolidation. The kingdoms of Europe were slowly becoming recognizable as entities with stable borders, yet war remained a constant element of life. Kings and nobles understood that territory alone could not ensure security. They needed armies, fortifications, and strategies that could withstand both sudden raids and long, methodical campaigns. In the British Isles, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms consolidated power through alliances, marriages, and warfare. Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex often clashed over territory and influence, yet they also faced the looming threat of Viking raiders. These Scandinavian warriors arrived in longships, navigating rivers and coasts with surprising speed, striking towns and monasteries, and disappearing before defenders could organize. Battles with Vikings were unique, sudden, fierce, and unpredictable. Unlike the methodical formations of continental armies, Viking engagements relied on speed, aggression, and the shock of surprise. One illustrative battle of this period is the Battle of the Conwy in Wales, where Mercian forces confronted a Viking raiding party. The Mercian army, composed largely of infantry with a few mounted nobles, established a defensive position along a narrow river valley. The Vikings, confident in their agility and experience in raiding, attempted a frontal assault, but the Mercian shield wall held firm. As the day progressed, archers on the flanks disrupted the Viking advance, and a counterattack by the Mercian cavalry ultimately forced the raiders to retreat. This engagement exemplifies a recurrent pattern, local forces adapting to an unpredictable enemy, combining defensive discipline with opportunistic strikes. Across the Channel, in Frankish lands, the Carolingian dynasty was coming to prominence. Charles Martel's victories in the early 8th century, particularly at Tours, had solidified Frankish dominance, but his successors faced a variety of challenges: internal revolts, Saxon uprisings, and threats along the eastern and southern frontiers. The Saxon Wars, fought intermittently from 772 onward under Charlemagne, illustrate the combination of relentless campaigning and strategic patience that defined this era. Saxon forces defending their homeland relied on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and fortified hill forts. Charlemagne responded with methodical campaigns, combining cavalry, infantry, and siegecraft to gradually subdue Saxon territories. The campaigns often lasted years, involving the construction of temporary fortresses, supply depots, and careful coordination across dispersed forces. Fortifications played a critical role in early medieval warfare. Towns, hill forts, and monasteries served as refuges, control points, and strategic objectives. Wooden palisades, earthen walls, and ditches were common, yet the principles of defense were sophisticated. Commanders understood the value of terrain. Hills, rivers, and narrow passes could amplify defensive strength. Siegecraft, though not as advanced as in later centuries, required planning, patience, and ingenuity. Attackers dug trenches, built ladders, and sometimes constructed rudimentary towers to breach walls. Defenders, in turn, relied on fire, boiling liquids, and missiles to repel assaults. The interplay of offense and defense created a slow, tense rhythm to warfare that could last days, weeks, or even months. In Iberia, the Visigothic kingdom was facing its own transformation. The political instability of the 7th century made it vulnerable to incursions from Muslim forces. Across the Strait of Gibraltar, by the early 8th century, these incursions culminated in significant battles, reshaping the cultural and political landscape. Local forces, often smaller and less organized, relied on knowledge of terrain, fortified towns, and rapid mobilization to resist the invaders. Cavalry and infantry were both essential, and leaders sought alliances with neighboring kingdoms to consolidate strength. Religion also intertwined deeply with warfare. The Christianization of Northern Europe introduced a moral and ideological framework to conflict. Kings claimed divine sanction for their campaigns, while monasteries and churches sometimes became centers of military logistics, providing supplies, intelligence, and safe havens. The merging of faith and military duty reinforced the emerging code of conduct for warriors, an early precursor to the chivalric ideals that would define later centuries. Moving back to the north, the Viking threat continued to reshape Europe. Their raids were not solely destructive. They also forced local leaders to innovate. Coastal defenses were strengthened, rivers were monitored, and local militias were trained to respond rapidly. In response, some kingdoms began to maintain standing forces, a departure from the earlier reliance on levies raised only in times of need. The integration of permanent military organization laid the foundation for larger, more disciplined armies in the High Medieval period. An important aspect of early medieval battles was logistics. Armies could not move far without food, water, and equipment. Supply lines had to be carefully planned, and the disruption of an enemy's provisions could determine the outcome of a campaign as decisively as direct combat. Commanders learned to utilize rivers for transport, to stockpile resources in advance of campaigns, and to adapt to changing conditions on the battlefield. The slow, methodical pace of campaigning was both a necessity and a reflection of the era's technological limitations. Consider a hypothetical campaign in the Frankish territories around the year 750. Local count, tasked with subduing a rebellious region, must coordinate infantry and cavalry, ensure that supplies reach forward positions, and establish temporary fortifications along key river crossings. Scouts are sent ahead to report on terrain and enemy movements, while messengers relay orders to detachments. Day by day, the army advances, encountering resistance in the form of ambushes, fortified villages, or hidden obstacles. Each encounter, though small by later standards, requires careful planning, discipline, and courage. The psychological strain on soldiers and commanders alike was immense. They faced exhaustion, disease, hunger, and constant threat. Yet they pressed onward, driven by duty, loyalty, and the promise of reward. By the late 8th century, Europe was entering a period of relative stabilization, yet conflict remained central to life. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800, exemplified the melding of political ambition and military strategy. His campaigns against the Saxons, Lombards, and other neighboring peoples demonstrate both the scale and the complexity of early medieval warfare. Cavalry became more prominent, infantry remained essential, and the use of fortifications and supply networks allowed armies to operate over greater distances than ever before. Battles were no longer merely isolated clashes. They were components of larger campaigns that could span years, reshaping entire regions. Even in periods of apparent peace, armies were a visible presence. Garrisons held towns, patrols monitored borders, and nobles maintained retinues of trained warriors. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and diplomatic gatherings often included displays of martial skill, reinforcing the connection between society and warfare. In this way, the early medieval world was a place where the rhythms of daily life were intertwined, with the potential for sudden conflict, and where strategy, courage, and endurance were constantly tested. Picture now a battlefield in the misty valleys of Saxony. Morning fog clings to the riverbanks. Soldiers, both infantry and cavalry, stand in quiet preparation, their breath visible in the cold air. The soft clanging of armor, the low hum of conversation, and the occasional neigh of horses create a rhythm that is both tense and oddly calming. Commanders survey the terrain, plan maneuvers, and communicate with messengers. The enemy is unseen, perhaps hidden behind hills or within forested slopes. Yet every man feels the anticipation. In these moments, long before the clash of swords and the roar of battle, the character of early medieval warfare is revealed. Patience, observation, and the steady application of skill and courage. The development of weaponry and armor during this period also influenced battles. Mail shirts, helmets, shields, and spears provided protection and offensive capability. Cavalry lances were designed to break lines of infantry, while axes and swords were forged to cut through armor and shields. Archery, though less dominant than in later centuries, played a crucial role in harassing enemy formations and protecting flanks. Each advancement reflected the practical realities of warfare, as well as the artistry and craftsmanship of blacksmiths and armorers. As the 8th century drew to a close, the landscape of Europe was beginning to take on a new order. The Carolingian dynasty, under the leadership of Charlemagne, sought not merely to defend territory, but to unify and expand a continent fragmented by centuries of upheaval. Charlemagne's ambition was vast. He envisioned a realm stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, a Christian empire restoring the unity of Rome in spirit, if not in exact form. Charlemagne's military campaigns were marked by meticulous planning, disciplined execution, and an adaptability that reflected both his intellect and the evolving demands of early medieval warfare. His armies were organized in a hierarchical fashion, with counts, dukes, and local leaders commanding contingents drawn from their own territories. The core of the Carolingian force remained heavy cavalry, though infantry provided a crucial backbone. Men-at-arms trained to hold positions, protect flanks, and support the cavalry, while mounted knights could exploit weaknesses or pursue fleeing enemies. The Saxon Wars, which began in 772 and continued intermittently for decades, exemplify the challenges and strategies of Charlemagne's campaigns. The Saxons, defending their homelands in the forests and hills of northern Germany, relied on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and fortified hill settlements. Charlemagne's forces responded with systematic campaigns, advancing slowly, securing supply lines, and constructing temporary fortifications to maintain their gains. These campaigns were not swift. They tested the endurance, morale, and strategic acumen of both attackers and defenders. One remarkable aspect of these campaigns was the use of fortifications and logistics. Temporary wooden forts, often called marching camps, were established along rivers, crossroads, and strategic hills. These allowed Charlemagne's forces to hold territory, coordinate movements, and secure provisions for extended campaigns. Supply lines were carefully maintained, using rivers where possible and stockpiling food and equipment in advance. Scouts and messengers played a vital role, providing intelligence on enemy movements and terrain, allowing commanders to plan their maneuvers with foresight and precision. The discipline and training of the Carolingian army were as essential as numbers and equipment. Soldiers were drilled in formation, signaling, and coordinated movements. Cavalry practiced charges in unison, while infantry perfected the shield wall and spear formations. Archers, though fewer in number, harassed enemy flanks and disrupted formations. This combination of arms allowed Charlemagne to conduct coordinated, multifaceted operations, where timing, positioning, and adaptability were as decisive as the courage of individual warriors. Beyond the battlefield, Charlemagne understood the psychological aspects of warfare. His campaigns were often accompanied by demonstrations of force designed to intimidate or compel surrender. Marches through conquered territory were orderly, disciplined, and highly visible. Fortifications were repaired or rebuilt, towns were garrisoned, and local populations were integrated through alliances, oaths of fealty, and religious conversion. Military success was inseparable from political stability. Victories had to be consolidated, not merely won. Meanwhile, the Carolingian military culture encouraged innovation. Siegecraft evolved, influenced by earlier Roman techniques and the experiences of campaigns in varied terrain. Wooden towers, battering rams, and siege engines were employed to reduce fortified positions. Defenders, in turn, relied on walls, ditches, and stockpiled supplies to resist prolonged attacks. Even in this early period, the interplay of attack and defense reflected a sophisticated understanding of strategy and human endurance. Charlemagne's campaigns also reached into the Iberian Peninsula, where the Muslim frontier in Al-Andalus represented both a military and ideological challenge. Skirmishes, sieges, and border raids were frequent, as Frankish forces sought to stabilize the frontier and protect Christian territories. These campaigns demonstrated the importance of reconnaissance, supply management, and coordination among disparate forces, as well as the growing significance of cavalry in both offense and defense. Simultaneously, in Britain and Ireland, warfare was transforming under the pressures of Viking raids. Norse longships allowed raiders to strike far inland, traveling up rivers and across coastlines with remarkable speed. Local forces responded by fortifying settlements, training militias, and adapting their defensive tactics. Some regions, such as Wessex, began maintaining permanent garrisons and watchtowers, marking a gradual shift toward standing armies rather than temporary levies, raised only during wartime. In addition to military innovation, the late 8th and early 9th centuries saw the development of a warrior ethos that blended loyalty, honor, and duty. Warriors were expected to defend their lord, territory, and faith with courage and skill. The bonds between lord and vassal, warrior and commander, were reinforced through ceremony, oath, and reward. Courage on the battlefield was not only a matter of survival, but a demonstration of moral and social virtue, contributing to the cohesion and effectiveness of armies. Charlemagne's campaigns were extensive, spanning hundreds of miles across forests, rivers, and mountains. Imagine a march through the dense Saxon forests. Armored knights move cautiously along narrow paths. Infantry hold the flanks and scouts probe ahead for ambushes. The air is thick with mist and the scent of damp earth. Birds stir nervously as men advance silently. The tension is palpable. One misstep, one unexpected attack, could unravel weeks of careful planning. Yet the army moves steadily, guided by strategy, discipline, and the unspoken rhythm of experienced soldiers. The combination of tactical innovation, logistical planning, and psychological insight allowed Charlemagne to secure victories that would shape the future of Europe. Fortifications were built and maintained, local populations integrated, and military forces organized in a way that allowed sustained campaigns over years, rather than isolated engagements. Armies became instruments not only of conquest, but of governance, capable of enforcing authority, protecting territory, and shaping political structures. During this period, the human experience of war remained constant. Soldiers endured long marches, harsh weather, and scarcity of food. Fear, fatigue, and uncertainty were omnipresent. Commanders faced the burden of responsibility for both victory and the lives of those under their command. Civilians observed from towns and villages, often caught between conflicting armies, hoping to survive and rebuild. The medieval battlefield was thus a complex tapestry of courage, endurance, strategy, and human interaction. Charlemagne's legacy extended beyond the battlefield. He inspired future generations of rulers and generals to integrate strategy, logistics, and moral authority into the conduct of war. His campaigns demonstrated the importance of preparation, discipline, and adaptability. Soldiers and leaders alike learned that courage alone was insufficient. Success required understanding terrain, supply, timing, and the coordination of diverse forces. As we conclude this part of our journey, imagine a quiet evening after a long campaign. The sun sets behind the hills, casting golden light on the fortifications and temporary camps. Soldiers tend to their horses, repair armor, and share quiet conversations. Fires glow softly in the encampment, illuminating tired faces and weary bodies. Scouts return with reports, and messengers carry orders for the next day's march. In this calm, we sense both the weight of human effort and the enduring rhythm of early medieval warfare, preparation, patience, endurance, and the constant vigilance required to survive and triumph. As Europe entered the late 8th and early 9th centuries, the continent faced a new and unprecedented challenge: the arrival of Viking raiders from Scandinavia. These seafaring warriors, traveling in their longships, could appear suddenly along coasts, rivers, and estuaries. Their attacks were swift, unpredictable, and often devastating. Unlike the formal battles of Carolingian Europe, Viking raids relied on mobility, surprise, and the ruthless application of force. For local populations, these incursions demanded adaptation. Coastal towns and monasteries built fortifications of timber and earth, sometimes reinforced with stone to withstand sudden assaults. Villages maintained watchtowers along rivers and coastlines, while small militias were trained to respond immediately to alarms. In England, Wessex became a model of defensive preparation under King Alfred, who emphasized fortified settlements, known as burhs, strategically placed to guard important roads, rivers, and towns. Each burh was connected to others, forming a network of communication and defense that allowed armies to respond efficiently to Viking movements. Viking warfare, while often brutal, also influenced the evolution of European armies. Local forces learned to integrate mobility into traditional formations, combining infantry, cavalry, and archers in ways that could counter fast-moving raiders. Commanders began to value intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and the rapid deployment of forces. Logistics, too, became more sophisticated. Supply depots were established near strategic locations, and river transport allowed armies to move efficiently across challenging terrain. Meanwhile, in the Iberian Peninsula, the Muslim Umayyad forces of Al-Andalus presented a different kind of challenge. These armies, often well-equipped, disciplined, and highly mobile, pressed into northern territories, clashing with Christian kingdoms in a series of raids, counterattacks, and sieges. Fortifications again proved essential. Mountain passes, river crossings, and fortified towns became critical strategic points. Local leaders relied on intimate knowledge of terrain, combined with disciplined infantry and cavalry, to hold off larger forces. Skirmishes were common, as smaller Christian forces harassed supply lines, ambushed detachments, and forced the enemy to disperse their strength. One notable example occurred during the early campaigns of the Kingdom of Asturias. Christian forces, though outnumbered, used fortified positions and the natural rugged terrain to withstand repeated Muslim incursions. Ambushes in mountain passes, well-timed cavalry raids, and coordinated defensive efforts allowed them to preserve territory and slowly push back against the invaders. These engagements exemplify a key principle of early medieval warfare. Strategy, terrain, and local knowledge could outweigh numerical superiority. In the north, Viking incursions were expanding beyond raiding into settlement and conquest. In Ireland, the Norse established trading towns and fortified settlements, creating permanent footholds. In England, the Danes gradually shifted from hit-and-run raids to more sustained campaigns, eventually leading to the establishment of the Danelaw. The presence of these settlers transformed local politics, military organization, and cultural dynamics. Local rulers had to respond not only with armies but also through diplomacy, alliances, and negotiated truces, reflecting the complex interplay between warfare and governance. Fortifications continued to evolve in response to these threats. Timber palisades were reinforced with stone, gates were made more secure, and towers were constructed to provide overlapping fields of fire. Castles, though not yet the massive stone fortresses of the high medieval period, became centers of administration, military organization, and refuge for surrounding populations. Siegecraft also became more systematic. Attackers employed ladders, siege towers, and early mechanical devices to breach walls, while defenders used boiling oil, missiles, and countermining techniques. The battle between offense and defense became a slow, measured contest, where patience and planning were often as decisive as courage. On the continent, Charlemagne's empire continued to expand, incorporating diverse peoples and territories. The campaigns against the Saxons and other northern tribes, combined with incursions into Lombard and Spanish territories, required constant adaptation. Charlemagne's forces demonstrated remarkable organizational skill. Armies were divided into contingents under trusted commanders. Fortifications and supply lines were maintained, and intelligence was gathered through scouts and local informants. Each campaign was a careful balance of speed, strength, and preparation. The human dimension of these campaigns cannot be overstated. Soldiers endured harsh weather, long marches, and limited rations. The psychological burden was immense, as danger was constant and the uncertainty of battle ever present. Commanders carried the weight of responsibility for their men, while civilians faced the disruption of invasion and the uncertainty of survival. Yet, amid the challenges, bonds were forged. Loyalty, courage, and endurance defined the relationships between leaders and soldiers, shaping the social fabric of medieval societies. Religious motivations also played a subtle but powerful role. The Carolingian campaigns were often framed in moral and spiritual terms. Charlemagne and his commanders portrayed military success as a defense of the Christian faith, while converts and allies were brought into the fold through both persuasion and compulsion. Monasteries and churches were not only centers of spiritual life, but also sources of strategic support. They provided intelligence, shelter, and supplies, reinforcing the connection between faith and military endeavor. The evolution of cavalry tactics was another hallmark of this period. Heavy cavalry, composed of armored knights or elite horsemen, began to dominate the battlefield. Cavalry charges could break enemy lines, pursue fleeing forces, and exploit weaknesses with devastating effect. Yet cavalry alone was insufficient. Infantry formations, archers, and local militias provided the necessary support, holding positions, defending flanks, and maintaining cohesion. Combined arms, the coordination of diverse troop types, became an increasingly important principle, foreshadowing the sophisticated tactics of later medieval warfare. Imagine now a campaign in northern France during the early 9th century. A Frankish army moves along a river valley, its banners flapping in the cold morning wind. Scouts patrol the forests, searching for signs of Viking raiders. Infantry march steadily, shields locked, while cavalry sweeps around the flanks, ready to strike. Engineers prepare temporary fortifications near key crossings. Messengers relay orders between divisions, while commanders study maps and terrain, calculating the best approach to secure victory. The air is tense yet calm, filled with anticipation. Here, the rhythm of early medieval warfare is evident, deliberate, disciplined and guided by knowledge, patience and strategy. By the end of this period, Europe had begun to see the integration of multiple military traditions. Carolingian heavy cavalry, Saxon guerrilla tactics, Viking mobility, and Iberian skirmishing techniques were all influencing one another. Commanders learned to combine these elements, adapting formations, logistics, and strategies to specific situations. The seeds of more sophisticated medieval warfare, which would flourish in the High and Late Middle Ages, were being sown. This era also left a legacy of human resilience. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians faced constant uncertainty, yet they persevered. Villages and towns were rebuilt after raids, armies reorganized after defeats, and knowledge of terrain, tactics, and logistics was carefully passed down. The interplay between endurance, adaptation, and courage shaped the medieval world, leaving lessons that would resonate for centuries. Let us reflect on the culmination of these early centuries of medieval warfare. From the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to the consolidation of Carolingian power, Europe had been a continent of constant movement, adaptation, and transformation. Kingdoms rose from the ruins of older empires, and armies evolved to meet the demands of increasingly complex campaigns. Charlemagne's empire stands as a testament to the sophistication and resilience of early medieval military organization. His campaigns combined infantry, cavalry, archers, and engineers in coordinated operations that stretched across hundreds of miles. Fortifications, both temporary and permanent, were constructed to secure territory and supply lines. Scouts and messengers ensured that commanders had the intelligence needed to make informed decisions. These methods were as much a part of victory as bravery on the battlefield. Beyond the battlefield, the human experience remained central. Soldiers endured fatigue, hunger, and fear. Commanders carried the weight of responsibility for their men, while civilians lived under the constant threat of raids or military movements. Yet communities adapted. Fortified towns, garrisoned burhs, and watchtowers allowed people to survive and rebuild. Networks of allies and vassals supported the defense of territory, integrating diplomacy, loyalty, and military force into a complex social fabric. The Viking and Muslim incursions of this period introduced new challenges that shaped European military thinking. Mobility, surprise, and adaptability became essential for defense. Armies learned to integrate local knowledge, reconnaissance, and rapid response, laying the groundwork for the professionalization of military forces in later centuries. the lessons of terrain, timing, and coordination, observed across countless skirmishes and campaigns, became part of a growing strategic tradition. The fortifications of the era, though humble compared to the stone castles of later centuries, represented a profound understanding of defense. Wooden palisades, earthworks, and early stone towers provided both security and a visible assertion of authority. Siegecraft, too, was evolving, with attackers developing methods to breach walls and defenders refining techniques to resist them. These contests of ingenuity and persistence, often prolonged and tense, revealed the slow, deliberate rhythm of early medieval warfare. As you imagine these landscapes, mist-covered valleys, rivers winding between hills, fortified towns with watchtowers, silhouetted against the morning sky, you may feel the quiet tension of armies on the move. Soldiers march in disciplined formation, banners flapping softly in the wind. Cavalry sweeps the flanks while archers position themselves to cover approaches. Scouts slip through forests and along riverbanks, eyes alert for signs of the enemy. The air is filled with anticipation, yet also with the calm precision of men who understand that preparation. Patience and endurance are as vital as courage. The early medieval period left an enduring legacy. Charlemagne's campaigns, the defense against Vikings and Muslim incursions, and the formation of early kingdoms established the patterns that would define warfare for centuries. Strategy, discipline, fortifications, and combined arms became central to military thought. Courage, loyalty, and resilience remained at the heart of human experience in war. The lessons of these centuries echo throughout history, shaping the battles and armies of the high and late medieval periods. And so, as this segment comes to a close, let us take a quiet moment to appreciate the rhythms of early medieval life. Imagine the setting sun casting golden light over rivers, hills and fortifications. Soldiers tend to horses and equipment, messengers carry instructions, and scouts return with reports of the day's movements. Fires glow softly in camps, illuminating tired faces and weary bodies. The calm before the next campaign, the next clash, the next raid, is filled with both tension and reflection. As we bring our journey through the early medieval centuries to a close, let us pause and reflect on the enduring patterns, lessons, and rhythms of this era. Over 3 centuries, Europe transformed from a continent fragmented by the fall of Rome into a tapestry of kingdoms, fortified towns, and emerging empires. Warfare, while ever present, was more than a series of bloody encounters. It was a defining element of society, shaping politics, culture, and the human experience. The armies of the early medieval period, whether Saxon, Frankish, Viking, or Iberian, shared certain common threads. Discipline, courage, and endurance were essential, but so too were strategy, planning, and adaptation. Commanders understood the importance of terrain, the value of fortifications, and the necessity of supply lines. They learned that a battle was not won solely through strength or bravery, but through intelligence, preparation, and the careful coordination of diverse forces. Fortifications, small as many were, marked the landscape with symbols of security and authority. Timber palisades, earthworks, and early stone towers provided refuge for civilians and served as bases for military operations. Siegecraft, though still in its infancy, demonstrated ingenuity and persistence on both sides. Attackers experimented with ladders, tunnels, and rudimentary engines, while defenders used every tool at their disposal to resist, from boiling liquids to countermines. Each engagement, whether a raid, skirmish, or pitched battle, contributed to the growing knowledge and sophistication of warfare. Charlemagne's campaigns stand as a testament to the integration of these lessons. His careful coordination of cavalry, infantry, and engineers, combined with fortified supply lines and strategic patience, allowed the Carolingian Empire to achieve victories across vast distances. The Saxon Wars, Iberian frontier campaigns, and northern expeditions against rebellious tribes exemplify a world in which strategy, endurance, and leadership were inseparable from the act of combat itself. Meanwhile, the Vikings and other external forces reminded Europe that adaptability was crucial. Fast-moving raiders challenged static defenses, compelling kingdoms to innovate and respond with speed, intelligence, and coordination. Across the continent, armies evolved to meet these challenges, laying the foundation for the larger, more sophisticated forces of the high medieval period. But beyond strategy and tactics, we must remember the human element. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike experienced fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. They endured harsh conditions, long marches, and sudden attacks. Yet amidst this, bonds of loyalty and camaraderie were forged. Communities rebuilt after raids, soldiers returned to duty after defeat, and knowledge of terrain, tactics, and logistics was carefully preserved and shared. Courage, endurance, and adaptability defined the human experience of war, leaving a legacy that would resonate for centuries. As evening falls over the early medieval landscape, imagine a quiet encampment nestled in a river valley. Soldiers sit by fires, tending their weapons and horses. Scouts return from distant hills with reports, while commanders quietly plan the next day's movements. A soft wind stirs the banners, and the last light of the sun casts long shadows over the fortified town. There is a calm here, a moment of reflection after centuries of conflict and adaptation, before the world of the High Middle Ages emerges with larger armies, more complex strategies, and the dawn of chivalric culture. The early medieval centuries have taught us that warfare was never merely about combat. It was about endurance, preparation, human ingenuity, and the interweaving of society, politics, and faith. It was about learning to move, to observe, to plan, and to act in the face of uncertainty. And above all, it was about the people who carried the weight of these centuries upon their shoulders, shaping history with every campaign, siege, and encounter. As this segment comes to its gentle close, let us carry forward the lessons of patience, strategy, and resilience. Let us imagine Europe at dawn, hills and rivers bathed in soft light, soldiers ready but at rest, and the promise of the centuries ahead stretching toward the horizon. In the next segment, we will journey into the high medieval period, witnessing the rise of the Crusades, the Norman expansion, and the evolution of warfare into an age of knights, castles, and grand campaigns that will define the next chapters of European history. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the earliest centuries of medieval battles. Let the echoes of this time settle softly in your mind, a gentle backdrop as we prepare to continue the story of Europe's evolving armies, leaders, and the enduring human spirit in the face of conflict.